our denomination uses to distribute at various times in crisis, and not just American crises, crises overseas, displaced refugees. They had a large disbursement of funds. And Steve and Leslie wrote that song as a way to recognize and honor that movement, that money, that way we can come together, though a small church, pool some of our funds with other American Baptist churches, and really make a difference when it counts. And so it's a very special song. Thank you for writing it and sharing it. So Luke 14. There are actually 10 different meal scenes in the Gospel of Luke. Now, I know that may not seem a lot. Similar to our meal count, we have 3 meals typically during the day. So Greco-Roman society and culture had 3 meals a day. So if you consider Jesus' ministry to be about roughly 3 years, give or take, 3 years, 365 times 3, you come up with well over thousands of meals that could have possibly been recorded in the life of Jesus' ministry. So it may not amount to much in scale, but when you look specifically at the Gospel of Luke, Luke records 7 more meals in Jesus' life and ministry than any of the other Gospels. Not only that, but in fact, much of Jesus' teaching is surrounded and couched in table fellowship, in places of meals and friendship. Not only that, but the disciples only recognized Jesus at the resurrection to be Jesus, in fact, after they had shared a meal with him. There was something that awoken in them at that time at a meal. Meals were very important in the Gospel of Luke. Another meal we see in the passage that Bobby read, so another teaching. And it's something worth noting. My son came up to me this past week, and he said, "Dad," he came home from school, and I do recognize the privilege that my kids went to school, and I know that there's a teacher strike that they struck for very good reasons and are now returning to school, I've heard this Monday, for Columbus Public. My kids go to Dublin City Schools, and so they started this past week. He said, "Dad, I eat with 8 friends." Now, for many folks, I know that that may not be a big deal. You eat with friends in a group, but for my son, Wiley, who struggles socially, struggles knowing what to say, struggles sometimes processing things, it's a pretty big deal. So when I saw him, I said, "Whoa, Wiley, that's great. Do you remember their names?" I asked. And so he started to recount, and he got to 3 names specifically, and then he stopped and he had to think. Wiley has autism, and so his processing takes a little bit longer than maybe yours or mine. He said, "Oh yes, and then there's Megan and there's Austin." "Oh," I said, I don't think I know Austin. "Can you tell me about him?" I asked. "Yeah, Austin's really funny," he said. "Austin tells me to stop talking all the time." But Dad, he says it like a friend. He says it jokingly. He's nice when he says it, Dad. And I said, "Well, that's great. It sounds like Austin is a good friend." Now, in a similar tone, much of Jesus' ministry happens around a table, a meal. A context similar to what Wiley experiences and you and I experience every day. A meal of friendship, relationship, and fellowship that happens around a meal. Jesus' words and teachings are couched in that social sphere of friendship, of camaraderie. And I think it's worth mentioning. Anything we glean from Christ's words are spoken in that sphere of friendship, of belonging, of trust, across a table, one to another. It's not a castigation as if one is looking down or standing over or proclaiming what you should or shouldn't be doing. It's someone who sits at a meal with you and knows you and sometimes tells you maybe to stop talking so much, jokingly, like a friend. Looking specifically at Luke 14, At face value, the parable reads something like this. When you're at a table, when you're invited to a dinner, a wedding banquet, for instance, take the low seat, Jesus said. Now, he tells the parable that at face value says to wait your turn until the host who presides over the meal recognizes you and says, come on, move up. Sit here. You belong closer. But I must admit that the dynamics of host, status, and power in that parable must be read with care. If we're to read and interpret this passage solely through the lens of privilege, as if Jesus is specifically talking to the elite, which he is, then it says something like this. Don't assume your status. Let your status instead be recognized publicly by the one in authority, the host who presides at the meal. Well, this reading has its problems. For whoever hosts grants authority to those whom he or she knows, which can devolve to some degree into something like a good old boys network. Oh, I know you. I see you. You move up here. Now, the dynamics of status and power come into even sharper focus if we read the parable through the lens of anyone who's experienced oppression, marginalization, or the general hushing that happens when you are a small fish in the host's big pond. If we're to view it through that lens, then the parable becomes a burden on the marginalized instead of a balm to the oppressed, which is hardly Jesus' message, which is indicated at the end, or the explanation, which is when you invite a dinner, invite those who can't repay you. But if we read the parable only as an expression of wait your turn, pipe down, let the host call you before you sit where you think you should, speak when you're spoken to, know your place, oh, and by the way, that's your divine calling, well, then the parable of power and dynamics becomes even more problematic. Stay put and wait for the host. Now, if, however, we push through some of these readings and the problems of those readings and hear it instead through the lens of identity and affirmation, we begin to see it not as a lesson on where to sit or waiting your turn, but a question that invites us to consider issues of identity and power. In other words, who gets to define you? And by what measure do they get to define you? And what if your host doesn't call you? And likewise, how do you define yourself? Is it through power or a better seat at the table? Or maybe it's something else? I'd like to respond to that with a question that I'd like to ask you. It's a rhetorical question, but at least I'd like for us to consider it. Why did you wake up today? I know it sounds crazy. And if you were to ask me, why did you wake up today? I'm not sure I would have an answer immediately. Of course, there's the urgent issues of food and bathroom. And then there's a vocational responsibility or career responsibilities. Well, I'm preaching today, so I needed to wake up. I thought it would be appreciated. And I also needed to pick up some drinks before the potluck and hot wings today, so I've got to get to the grocery store before I come. But in other terms, it's a tricky question. It could be easier to answer a question like, why did you come to Ohio State University, for instance? Or to Capital University? Or to Columbus State? Or what brought you to Columbus in general? Now, those things can be easily answered with some tangible responses, like, for instance, statistics. Ohio State University is a fantastic school. Capital fit my degree program perfectly. Columbus offered me the best career opportunities and advancement. But why did you wake up this morning? That's a little different. Yet as we look at mental health and well-being, psychology says that answering that question itself, that indicates that answering it is vital to our identity, our purpose, our direction, our decision-making, and even our happiness and well-being. And I believe answering it also gets us closer to Jesus' parable and the prophet Jeremiah's invitation. And I'd like us to consider those questions. Now, studies done on identity and interviews have underscored the value of responding to questions like these, the big questions, the questions about meaning and purpose and who we are and why we are. Like, why do you wake up? And there's a value in responding to it, as studies suggest, even if, for instance, it's just a tentative response. It's not a response you're ready to write in stone, but at least it's your best guess. One of those studies took 100 different job applicants for a mock interview for a study. And some were asked to consider, prior to the interview, why? Why were they here? What did they really want in life? What was their raison d'etre, their reason for being? The control subjects who then would enter the interview. Now, those who had sat and actually identified their reasons for being at this place, at this time, this seat, so to speak, when interviewed for the positions, were more assessed to be forthright and confident. Not only were they assessed by the interviewers in that manner, but they also received the job offer 2-to-1. Now, the effects were profound, but also the self-reporting of themselves who experienced the interview process said that they didn't have to pretend, that they knew who they were when they sat at the table, whether the interview called them forward or not. They knew who they were and where to sit and where to stand. Now, research was also done among janitorial staff at a large metropolitan hospital. Now, at this hospital, a recent workplace, and I don't know if you've ever had the workplace assessments that you don't know where they go, but you've turned it in and you think it's going to go someplace. Well, this assessment actually reached out beyond its field. This hospital asked for all staff to indicate their own happiness or satisfaction in their position and at their work. Now, at this time, the workplace assessment revealed that the janitorial staff was cut in the middle. Half experienced incredible amounts of satisfaction, and the other half experienced very low amounts of satisfaction. Now, digging deeper into this, actually it came upon Amy, and I'm going to mispronounce her name, she's a professor at the Yale School of Management, Wierzynowski, conducted interviews among the janitorial staff to find out what exactly was the issue at hand, what divided the staff so evenly. And she did so by interviewing each one of the janitorial staff with this one simple question. Please, she said, can you tell me what you do in your job? Now, as you can imagine, each half responded quite differently to these questions. The ones with high job satisfaction described their work as helping patients to heal and supporting families at a very vulnerable time in their lives. Now, the other half of the staff, those who reported very low levels of job satisfaction, described their work and responded to her question by simply lining out the tasks that they did. I scrubbed the floors. I prepped the rooms. I emptied the wastebaskets. The janitors that connected the why, their why, to their what, enjoyed their day, expressed incredible amounts of job satisfaction, and derived a great deal of meaning and purpose, not just through cleaning and prepping the rooms, but understanding it as part of a network within that hospital, supporting these people at very vulnerable times. Natalie Kagan, in her book, Happier Now, writes this: having a sense of your greater purpose, your why, can sustain you and inspire you when things are good and can be a powerful motivator when things are not so good. So let me ask you again. Why did you wake up this morning? Now, the prophet Jeremiah considers some of these themes. When Israel, the people of God, begin to forget their why, their first love, their reason for being. Why have you gone after false gods who lead you to worthlessness? You've lost who you are, your deepest, truest sense as my beloved people, blessed to be a blessing to the nations. You've lost that. And the prophetic word invites Israel then to recalibrate itself, and I believe maybe also invites us today to recalibrate ourselves. What is your first love? What is your meaning and purpose? What is your why? Now, I want to say that I'll never suggest what your why should be. A pastor friend of mine said, if you ever see yourself or hear yourself saying should a lot in a sermon, you're shoulding on your people. He said, don't should on your people. And so I'll try not to. This is not a should. Now, I'd actually be remiss, in fact, to begin to express your why. Not only as a Baptist who believes in the freedom of the individual conscience, that you get to work out your salvation, your way in the world with God. And I, as the authority host, do not get to tell you, in fact, how to do it. Amen. I can help you along the way. But I do want to offer a few suggestions, not on why, but on a process of uncovering your meaning and purpose. The first, to answer the question why you wake up in the morning, look at your strengths. What are you really good at? What do you gravitate toward? What do you already do well? Look at those things and own them. And simply like that mental healthy song that Stephen Leslie said, know you're a miracle. And that you do bring strengths and gifts to the table, whether it's here in this church or at the university or in your community or neighborhood. That you have much to offer. The second thing is to look within your context, not without. Many people begin to answer the question why by thinking that they have to do or be or become somebody else to discover their meaning, when often it's not the case. In fact, in some of the writings I've read, they say to look at your to-do list. Instead of trying to discover a top-down approach, look what you're already doing and prioritizing, and simply begin to look and identify your why. And if it's off course from who you really are, you get to recalibrate a little bit. Well, maybe my new shoes aren't as important as I thought they would. Maybe my real why, one of my whys, is to support my family. Support them in who they're becoming and who they need to be. And I need to get better at it. That's one of my whys. Number 3, be open to the day. Be open to your course of study, new students. Be open to what you're discovering and learning. Be open to the new threads that interest you and that you just want to pull on them. And be curious. Invite the day to come. And then finally, don't put too much pressure on yourself. A lot of people, in fact, burn out with their own self-expectations of what they should or shouldn't be doing. They should on their own selves, so to speak, which can have its own cycle. So be gracious with yourself. And one of the things that I want finally to mention is to celebrate the host of the Lord's table, of God's table. Please know that when you approach that table, the table that Jesus presides over and where Jesus is the host, I want you to know where that is, because these will be somewhat of the words that you'll hear. You are deeply loved by God, fully pleasing, totally accepted and complete at this table. As we ask the questions why, may we do so around a gracious host table who loves us, who jokes with us, and teaches us in the fellowship and in the community and intimacy of love and of grace.